Guys, boxing gossip here. I'm sort of vested is going to get some stick, but I'm absolutely boiling, so please accept my apologies. Today we're discussing Dillian Whyte. Let me start by saying on Dillian Whyte, the loss to Anthony Joshua, and in my opinion it was a bad loss. It was a heavy knockout, after he was outboxed for several, if not the majority of the rounds of the fight. Has not affected Dillian Whyte's marketability. It's actually been a loss that, if anything, has improved his position within the market, improved his name, improved his image, and he's emerged from that fight with a great deal of credit. Typically, I don't like seeing prospect heavyweights rust. I believe that heavyweight knockouts are very, very dangerous, and a knockout of epic proportions can cause huge damage to a heavyweight's career, be that physical damage through injury, be that mental damage through the psychological blow of being heavily knocked out. Regardless, that knockout loss to Anthony Joshua does not seem to have does not seem to have affected Dillian Whyte's marketability and Dillian Whyte's confidence. He's on the route to coming back from that loss. He's signed with Matchroom. He's got a fight against a French heavyweight called Cecil. I can't remember the guy's surname off the top of my head. And there's already a lot of talk about Dillian Whyte. There's a lot of talk about Dillian Whyte fighting David Haye. A lot of talk about an Anthony Joshua rematch. A lot of talk about Dillian Whyte squaring off with Joseph Parker, Derek Chisora, and other ones. And I think my concern with Dillian Whyte at this stage is that we are going to see him in no-risk fights, such as this French heavyweight, Cecil, who he's going to be in with, and then fights on the major stage. I wonder if that's what Eddie Hearn's going to do with him. Having watched the recent Anthony Joshua Brazil build-up for their fight, I think Eddie Hearn is very keen to make that rematch, because Dillian Whyte is a real asset in terms of selling a fight, and that hype and that chemistry between Joshua and Dillian Whyte is going to lead to serious money and serious interest, especially with a rematch being for the world title. So my concern is we're going to see Dillian Whyte in very low-end fights that don't possibly pose a risk, and then jumped up straight away to those world-level fights, be that Joshua or something else. So the next guy he's in with, I'm just looking at my notes, it's not Cecil, sorry, it's Cyril Leonard. Apologies to Cyril if you're watching. And Cyril's record is 10 wins, 8 losses, 2 draws. So in other words, 50% of the time he stepped into the ring, he's not won. He's been knocked out 3 times, and of his 10 wins, 3 of them have come by knockout. So not the biggest puncher, a guy who hasn't won 50% of the time he stepped into the ring, a guy who's been knocked out several times. In 2014, he was outpointed by a guy with a 9-win, 9-loss, 3-draw record. No notable wins on Cyril's record. Perhaps his most notable win was Fabrice Aurieng. And that was a guy who was recently beaten by Dave Allen. So yeah, Cyril Leonard, this is the typical example of what I mean, in that we're probably going to see Dillian Whyte in these, what I class as no-risk fights at this stage. And the thing for me is, we know Dillian Whyte's a very good fighter. We know he's an exceptionally good fighter against the Cyril Leonards of this world, against the Nascimentos of this world. The question for me is this fight simply too easy? To be the best that Dillian Whyte can be, for me, he needs the learning fights. And for me, this is something this video is going to hinge upon, is the importance of learning fights in building a heavyweight prospect. I don't say every time a heavyweight needs learning fights. I did a video on David Price recently where I said he needs to be targeting cash-out fights, not learning fights, because he's not going to get value from learning fights. So rather than risking taking a loss, he needs a cash-out fight. I did a video on Joseph Parker recently saying he needs the very tough learning fights. And I think Dillian Whyte is in a similar boat. I mean, if you look at his performance against Anthony Joshua, and Dillian Whyte's got a lot going for him. He's extremely marketable. He's a great talker. He's a likeable guy. He's a very big puncher. He's got a heart. He's got chin. There is a lot going for Dillian Whyte, don't get me wrong. But if we do look at his performance against Anthony Joshua, let's be honest, a lot went wrong. Whyte's conditioning was horrible. You could see that both in his physical appearance and the stamina he showed when he was in the ring. His punches, in my opinion, and look, Dillian Whyte's a better boxer than I'll ever be, but from the cheap seats here, his punches were terribly constructed. You know, it looked like his jab was completely incorrectly constructed. He wasn't throwing his jab properly. His punches were wide. They were slappy. There was no speed, no snap to them. I actually feel Dillian Whyte could have won this fight if he'd had 3 or 4 learning fights in the lead up to Joshua. You know, he had Joshua in problems at various stages of that fight. He took Joshua into deep water. And for me, he let himself down by the poor construction of his punches and the poor conditioning. And, you know, I think that mistake's been made in Dillian Whyte's career once. I think it hasn't costed him. It hasn't affected his marketability. It hasn't affected his future. But I wouldn't like to see it being made again. And I think in order for Dillian Whyte to be the best he can be, learning fights are absolutely key. I mean, if we actually look at Dillian's career today, I don't believe he's ever gone beyond 7 rounds. And I haven't box rec that to check. But I believe the Anthony Joshua fight was actually the latest he'd ever been in a fight. And if you look at Dillian's best wins, you know, I had someone say to me earlier today, Dillian Whyte deserves to be a top 20, top 30 heavyweight, you know. And I must say I completely disagree. If you look at his wins alone, who are Dillian Whyte's best wins? Brian Minto? Nascimento? I mean, would you consider either of those guys to be top 50 heavyweights? I certainly wouldn't. Dillian Whyte's beaten nobody in the top 50. You know, his best wins are against well-known journeymen, let's be honest. He's never been beyond 7 rounds. He's showing poor conditioning. He's showing poor technique when throwing punches. There is a lot to learn for Dillian Whyte. He can be a very good fighter, but he's not there yet. And the learning fights are key to ensure he doesn't make the same mistakes as he did in that Joshua fight. Because let me repeat, I think he could have won that fight if he'd had an appropriate build-up. And I don't want to see the same thing happen again. I don't like to see fighters not fill their potential. And I don't think Dillian Whyte fulfilled his potential in that Joshua fight. And I'd like to see him still go on to fulfill his potential in the rest of his career. You know, there's some talk that he'll fight David Allen for the British title and then maybe defend that against Derek Chisora, you know, later on in the year. And let me say, those are both sensible fights. They're profile-building fights. They're exciting fights. They're fights that Dillian Whyte should win if he's anywhere near the level people expect him to be. You know, Dave Allen looks like a decent prospect. Derek Chisora is a solid yardstick. But let's be honest, if Dillian Whyte is to even become a European heavyweight, let alone a top 20 world heavyweight, he needs to be handling Dave Allen and Derek Chisora. So those fights are sensible matchups for me. But after those fights, I don't want to see him chuck straight in with Joshua. You know, because let's be honest, beating Derek Chisora, beating Dave Allen, they're good wins. They'd be the best wins of Dillian's career, but they're not wins that are going to propel him to the very elite level of the sport. You know, I'd like to see him with Malik Scott. I'd like to see him with Tony Thompson. I'd like to see him with Alexander Ustinov. I'd like to see him with Alexander Dimitrenko. You know, if we look at the route Hughie Fury's taken, I know Hughie Fury's criticised, but Fred Cassie, Dominic Gwynn, Andre Rudenko, those sort of fights are going to prepare him. Any one of those names. You know, he's with Eddie Hearn, he's with Matchroom. Let's see Eddie Hearn invest some money in his development now. You know, someone like Dominic Gwynn, right? He's not the best fighter in the world. He's not someone who's going to beat Dillian Whyte. But he's going to come out and he's going to give him real experience of going rounds, as is Andre Rudenko. You know, maybe guys like Tony Thompson, Alexander Ustinov. These are guys who can really test you. These are guys who are going to develop you. You know, look at the learning experience Parker recently had with Carlos Takam. A fight like that will be absolutely invaluable for Dillian Whyte if his genuine intention is to get a world title. You know, these are absolutely key for me, and I'd love to see him, you know, have 4 or 5 fights at that sort of level. You know, there's no need to rush. You know, the big fights aren't going anywhere. He's still a young guy. He's got money in the bank, hopefully. He's got huge earning potential ahead of him. Let's see him get those experience he needs under himself so he can do himself justice. You know, as I said at the start of this video, some fighters need to cash out without risking the learning fights. I already mentioned the video I did on David Price. You know, David Price can't afford to take a learning fight against an Alexander Ustinov, because he may get beaten. He may get beaten in that fight. And also, the faults that David Price has in his game, the weaknesses, for me, they're not going to be ironed out at this stage, you know, by fighting a Ustinov or a Dimitrenko. But with Dillian Whyte, it's a bit different, you know. Younger guy, doesn't have the amateur Olympic pedigree, doesn't have as many professional fights. And his issues, for me, are more manageable than Price's issues. You know, as I say, it's a conditioning issue, it's a jab issue, it's a punch construction issue. I think those issues could be ironed out by learning fights. Fighters can improve by tests. We see this time and time again. I said Parker to Cam. We can look at other examples. Look at Hughie Fury. That is the blueprint I'd like for Dillian Whyte to see. The guy's got huge potential, and with that potential and with the character he has comes huge earning potential and huge ability to make waves in this heavyweight division. But for me, the mega fight shouldn't be rushed. I don't want to see Dillian Whyte fighting David Haye in the next year. I don't want to see Dillian Whyte fighting Anthony Joshua in the next year. I'd like to see Dillian Whyte and his handlers considering the potential for an entire career, a 10-year career. For me, whilst it may not be what the average fan wants to see, I'd probably more like to see him take the Hughie Fury route of fighting the Cassies, the Gwynns, the Rudenkos. If we can get Allen and Chisora more marketable fights, all the better. If Eddie Hearn can deliver that with his Sky budget, all the better. But if not, those are the names that I'd like to see him in with. Let's look at Tyson Fury, best heavyweight in the world, for example. He has, he's improved dramatically. You look at Tyson Fury 3 or 4 years ago, and the faults in his game, the problems with him were evident. They were obvious to see. How did he work that out? Well, it was the fights against the Cunninghams, the Chisoras. I can't remember all the guys he fought now. Nevin Pikitz, Pikitz and Nikolai Furfer. Those sort of names. Those names may be a bit older these days, and you'd look to bring in the next generation. But for me, that's what Dillian Whyte needs. And you look at Vladimir Klitschko, he took some heavy knockout losses early on in his career. And then he went away, he reinvented himself, and he came back. Dillian Whyte can do that. But Dillian Whyte's whole career shouldn't be about cashing out against Anthony Joshua. At this stage, my belief is David Price's entire career is about cashing out against Anthony Joshua. I understand the allure of that. I understand the chance that you could knock Joshua out and be a world champion. I understand it's probably a 7-figure payday. But someone like Dillian Whyte, who's so young, who's got the attributes, who's got the personality, there's a big opportunity out there for him. And I'd like to see him developed in the right way. As I say, this guy's best wins are Nascimento and Minto. He's never been beyond 7 rounds. He's never beaten a top 50 heavyweight. Dillian Whyte is a way off even the Kubrat Pulevs, the Bryant Jennings, the Romain Staverns of this world. Let's give him the fights he needs to get to that level and give him the best chance of doing himself justice in a rematch against Joshua or a fight against David Haye. Let me know your thoughts. If you've enjoyed this video, hit the thumbs up button. If you're new to the channel, please do subscribe. Many thanks.